On the morning of October 17, 2018, a quiet wedding hall in a small American town sat frozen in a strange kind of silence. The decorations were already in place from the night before. White flowers hung neatly from the chairs. The aisle was prepared. Soft lights still glowed along the walls, and on several tables half-finished champagne glasses stood exactly where guests had left them during the rehearsal celebration. It should have been a morning filled with laughter, music, and excitement. Nearly 200 guests were expected to arrive within hours to celebrate what everyone believed would be the happiest day of two people's lives. Instead, the room felt empty, almost abandoned, as if time had suddenly stopped in the middle of a celebration that never finished. At the center of it all stood a bride named Emily Carter, already dressed in the gown she had dreamed about for months. She waited near the front of the hall, staring toward the entrance doors again and again, expecting them to open at any moment. Her fiancé, Daniel Brooks, was supposed to arrive early that morning with his best man to prepare for the ceremony. That was the plan they had talked about the night before. Friends had seen them laughing together at the rehearsal dinner. Family members remembered how excited Daniel seemed when he spoke about the future they were about to begin. Nothing about the evening gave anyone the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. But as the minutes passed that morning, Daniel never appeared. His phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. At first, everyone assumed it was a small delay. Maybe he overslept after the long evening. Maybe he stopped somewhere to pick up coffee for the wedding party. Yet, after another 30 minutes, concern began to spread quietly through the room. The best man tried calling him. No answer. One of Daniel's close friends drove past his apartment, expecting to find him rushing out the door late. But the parking lot was empty, and Daniel's car was nowhere to be seen. Within an hour, the celebration had turned into confusion. Guests arriving early for the ceremony noticed the worried expressions on the faces of family members whispering in corners. Emily stood near the dressing room with her phone clutched tightly in her hand, sending message after message that never received a reply. Daniel Brooks, the man she was supposed to marry that afternoon, had disappeared sometime during the night.
No goodbye. No explanation.
No note left behind. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his life without leaving a trace. Before we go deeper into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As the hours passed that morning, concern slowly turned into alarm. Emily's father was the one who finally suggested calling the police. At first, officers treated it like a simple missing person situation. Adults sometimes leave unexpectedly. Weddings can create pressure, and sometimes people panic. Investigators asked basic questions. When was the last time anyone saw Daniel? Did he mention plans to travel? Was there any sign of an argument between the couple the night before? But the answers only deepened the mystery. The last confirmed sighting of Daniel came from a security camera outside his apartment building at 2:13 in the morning. The footage showed him walking calmly toward his car, dressed in jeans and a dark jacket. He didn't appear frightened or rushed. He simply unlocked his vehicle, got inside, and drove away into the quiet streets of the town. That was the final moment anyone could prove he was alive and well. Investigators checked his apartment later that day and found nothing out of place. His wedding suit still hung in the closet, carefully pressed and ready for the ceremony. His phone charger remained plugged into the wall. The refrigerator held groceries he had purchased just 2 days earlier. Every detail suggested someone preparing for a wedding and a future, not someone planning to disappear. By the afternoon, word had spread throughout the community. News crews began gathering outside the wedding venue, filming the unusual story of a groom who vanished just hours before his own ceremony. Friends spoke to reporters, insisting Daniel was responsible, dependable, and deeply in love with Emily. They described a man who had spent weeks helping plan the wedding and talking about the honeymoon they would take along the coast of California. Then investigators uncovered something that changed the direction of the entire case. Daniel's car was discovered parked near a remote hiking trail roughly 30 miles outside town. The vehicle was locked, and his wallet was still inside the glove compartment. The keys were sitting in the center console as if someone had placed them there carefully before leaving. But Daniel himself was nowhere in sight. Search teams spent the next 2 days combing the surrounding woods with dogs and helicopters, hoping to find some sign that would explain why he had been there in the middle of the night. They found nothing. 3 days later, another discovery stunned everyone following the case. Daniel's credit card was used at a gas station nearly 900 miles away in northern Arizona. The purchase was small, just a tank of gas and a bottle of water, but the timestamp was confirmed. Someone had used the card at 11:42 p.m. The question investigators immediately asked was simple but unsettling. Was Daniel alive and traveling across the country on his own? Or had someone else taken his card after something terrible happened? Suddenly, the story no longer looked like a simple missing person case. If Daniel had chosen to run away from his wedding, why leave his wallet behind in the car? If he had been harmed near the hiking trail, how did his credit card end up being used almost 1,000 miles away? And so the mystery that began inside a quiet wedding hall grew larger with every passing day. Detectives faced 2 possibilities that seemed equally confusing. Either Daniel Brooks walked away from the life he had carefully built, leaving behind the woman he planned to marry and the family who trusted him, or someone made sure he never reached that wedding at all. So the question that continues to echo through this story is simple. Did Daniel run away from the biggest commitment of his life? Or did someone make sure he never made it there? In the hours after Daniel Carter vanished, the quiet town where he and Emily Rhodes lived began asking the same questions investigators were struggling to answer. Daniel was not a stranger passing through the community. He was known by neighbors, co-workers, and friends as someone reliable, someone who showed up when people needed him. Emily Rhodes was equally familiar to the town. She worked long shifts at a local hospital and had built a reputation as someone compassionate and hardworking. When the 2 of them announced their engagement the year before, friends described it as the kind of love story people hoped for in a place where everyone knew each other. Their wedding invitations had been sent weeks earlier, decorated with soft gold lettering that read, "Daniel Carter and Emily Rhodes request the honor of your presence." Photos from their engagement shoot showed them standing together near a mountain lake in Colorado, smiling as if the future had already been written. To anyone watching from the outside, their relationship seemed steady and full of promise. Social media posts showed Daniel proudly helping Emily move into the house they planned to share after the wedding. Family members remembered the way he spoke about starting a new chapter together. Emily often posted pictures of the wedding preparations, from tasting cakes with friends to choosing flowers for the ceremony. Each update drew dozens of comments from people excited to attend the celebration. It was the kind of story people in town followed with genuine happiness. 2 people building a life together, surrounded by supportive families and a community that believed their marriage would last for years. But when investigators began retracing the final days before Daniel disappeared, small details started to surface that didn't quite fit the image everyone believed. A neighbor who lived next door to the couple later told police she remembered hearing raised voices coming from the house about a week before the wedding. At the time, she assumed it was just stress from planning such a large event. Weddings can bring pressure, and arguments between couples preparing for a big day are not unusual. Yet the neighbor remembered something specific about that evening. She said the argument sounded serious, and she recalled Daniel leaving the house late that night and sitting in his car for nearly an hour before returning inside. Another detail emerged when detectives reviewed Daniel's phone records. Late on the night before the wedding, just hours before the security camera captured him leaving his apartment at 2:13 in the morning, Daniel received a call from a number that investigators did not immediately recognize. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. There was no voicemail afterward, no follow-up message, and the number itself appeared to be unregistered. Whoever placed the call had used a prepaid phone that offered no obvious clues about its owner. The timing immediately raised questions. At 2:13 a.m., Daniel Carter walked calmly out of his home and drove away into the dark streets of the town. The camera footage showed nothing unusual about his behavior. He did not appear frightened or rushed. He didn't carry luggage or any obvious belongings. He simply left, as if he were going somewhere for a short errand before returning home. Yet he never came back. As investigators examined the timeline more closely, the unanswered questions began stacking up in ways that made the case far more complicated than anyone expected. Why did Daniel leave his house at exactly 2:13 that morning when he had a wedding scheduled just hours later? Who was the person behind the mysterious phone call that reached him shortly before he stepped outside? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all came from something one of the detectives quietly told a reporter days after the investigation began. According to that investigator, the evidence they were starting to uncover suggested the situation might not be a typical disappearance. In fact, he reportedly said something that changed the way many people looked at the entire case. He explained that, from the beginning, certain details pointed in a direction most people had not yet considered. And in a brief statement that would later be repeated across local news stations, he said something that made the mystery even deeper. This case, he said, was never really about a missing person. It was about a lie. To understand why Daniel Carter's disappearance shook the town so deeply, investigators first had to understand the man himself. Daniel was 38 years old at the time he vanished, a construction project manager who had spent nearly 15 years building a reputation for reliability. He was the kind of person coworkers trusted to handle difficult projects and tight deadlines without losing his composure. Friends described him as calm, practical, and dependable, someone who rarely acted on impulse. For years he had worked long hours managing building crews across different parts of Colorado, slowly building a stable life for himself and the one person who mattered most to him, his young daughter. Daniel had been married once before, but tragedy changed that chapter of his life. His first wife passed away after a sudden illness several years earlier, leaving him to raise their daughter alone while trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy. Those close to him said the loss changed Daniel in quiet ways. For a long time he focused almost entirely on work and family, avoiding relationships and turning down invitations from friends who tried to encourage him to move forward. It wasn't that he had stopped believing in love. It was simply that he had learned how fragile life could be, and he seemed hesitant to open himself to that kind of loss again. That was why many people in his circle were surprised when he eventually began dating Emily Rhodes. When friends first heard about her, they noticed something different in Daniel almost immediately. He sounded hopeful again, like someone who had finally allowed himself to imagine a future that felt complete. Emily Rhodes was 34 years old and worked as a nurse at a regional hospital about 20 minutes from town. Patients often remembered her kindness long after leaving the hospital, and coworkers described her as someone who never hesitated to stay late when another nurse needed help finishing a shift. Her warm personality made her well known throughout the community. People often recognized her in local grocery stores or coffee shops because she had cared for them or a family member during a difficult time. When Daniel and Emily began appearing together at small community events, neighbors quickly noticed how naturally they seemed to fit into each other's lives. The two of them met during a charity fundraiser organized by the hospital where Emily worked. The event was raising money for pediatric medical equipment, and Daniel's construction company had sponsored part of the venue setup. According to friends who were there that evening, their first conversation lasted nearly an hour. What started as a simple introduction gradually turned into a longer discussion about family, work, and the unexpected ways life can change direction. By the end of the night, they exchanged phone numbers, and within weeks they were spending most of their free time together. Daniel's friends later said they hadn't seen him smile that much in years. Their relationship moved forward quickly but comfortably. Emily became close with Daniel's daughter, helping with school activities and weekend outings that gradually formed the feeling of a blended family. Social media posts from that time showed the three of them hiking through Colorado trails, celebrating birthdays, and spending holidays surrounded by relatives who seemed genuinely happy for them. 18 months after they first met, Daniel proposed during a quiet trip to the mountains. The engagement announcement spread through the town within hours, and comments poured in from friends congratulating them on the next chapter of their lives. As the wedding approached, the couple shared glimpses of their preparations online. Emily posted photos from dress fittings and cake tastings, while Daniel joked about learning how complicated seating charts could become when both families had large groups of relatives traveling in from different states. Vacation photos showed them exploring small coastal towns during a short trip they took the summer before the wedding. In one picture, Daniel stood beside Emily on a beach, holding her hand while the sunset reflected across the water. To most people following their story, everything about the relationship looked genuine and steady. Yet when investigators later spoke with friends and coworkers after Daniel vanished, a few of them began recalling small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. One coworker mentioned that Daniel appeared distracted during meetings in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Another friend remembered that Daniel had originally planned a short bachelor trip with a group of close friends but canceled it unexpectedly about a month before the ceremony. At the time, he brushed it off by saying work had become too busy to take the time away. His friends accepted the explanation without much thought. There were also the phone calls. According to people who spent time with Daniel during those final weeks, he occasionally stepped outside to answer calls he didn't explain. Sometimes he would return to the room looking thoughtful or slightly tense, though he rarely spoke about the conversations afterward. One friend later told investigators that Daniel had begun checking his phone more frequently than usual during group outings, almost as if he was waiting for a message that never arrived. When detectives interviewed Daniel's closest circle after the disappearance, many of them struggled to reconcile those small memories with the man they believed they knew. Daniel Carter had always been direct and honest with the people close to him. The idea that he might secretly be dealing with something serious without telling anyone felt unusual to those who trusted him. One longtime friend summed it up in a quiet conversation with investigators. Looking back on those final weeks, he admitted there were moments when Daniel seemed slightly preoccupied, but nothing that felt alarming at the time. That friend later said something investigators would remember as the case unfolded. He explained that hindsight often changes how people interpret memories, and sometimes small details that seemed ordinary suddenly appear meaningful once something tragic happens. Then he paused and added a sentence that would stay with detectives as they continued examining Daniel's life. Looking back, he said, something felt off. The comment didn't immediately provide answers, but it encouraged investigators to examine every detail from the weeks leading up to the wedding. Phone records, financial activity, and travel plans all became part of the timeline they were slowly building. As they traced those details more carefully, they eventually discovered something unexpected hidden among the records of Daniel's calls. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel Carter had made a phone call that nobody in his life knew about. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel Carter made a phone call that nobody in his life knew about. Investigators would eventually find it buried in his phone records, placed late in the evening to a number that was not saved in his contacts. The call lasted just over 4 minutes. What was said during that conversation remains unknown, but the timing of it would later take on a much heavier meaning once the events of the final night began to unfold. Because when detectives started reconstructing Daniel's last 24 hours, they discovered that everything leading up to his disappearance looked, on the surface, completely normal. The night before the wedding began with what most people would remember as a joyful rehearsal dinner. Friends and relatives gathered at a restaurant not far from the venue where the ceremony was scheduled to take place the next afternoon. Long tables were filled with family members who had traveled from different parts of the country, many of them meeting each other for the first time. Daniel's daughter sat beside him as people shared stories about the couple, laughing at memories from their early days together. Emily Rhodes moved from table to table greeting guests and thanking them for making the trip. Cameras captured small moments throughout the evening. Daniel raising a glass during a toast, Emily wiping away tears while her sister spoke about their childhood, and friends teasing the groom about how nervous he might feel the next day. Several people later said the atmosphere that night felt relaxed and warm. Daniel seemed comfortable, smiling as he spoke with co-workers who had come to celebrate with him. At one point, he stood beside Emily while their parents gave short speeches welcoming everyone to the families that were about to join together. The restaurant staff eventually turned on music, and a few couples even stepped onto a small dance floor near the back of the room. It looked like the perfect beginning to a wedding weekend. As the evening continued, guests slowly began leaving to get some rest before the ceremony the next day. By around 11:30, only close friends and family remained. Daniel appeared slightly tired but still in good spirits. Witnesses later said he hugged several relatives goodbye and joked about needing enough sleep so he wouldn't look exhausted in the wedding photos. At exactly 11:45 p.m., Daniel told Emily he was heading home to get some rest before the early morning preparations. According to Emily, their last conversation that night was simple. He kissed her goodnight, reminded her not to stay up too late celebrating with her friends, and promised he would see her in the morning. For a few hours after that, nothing seemed unusual. Emily remained with her bridesmaids, continuing the celebration for a little while longer before eventually heading home herself. Daniel arrived at his apartment shortly after midnight, according to a nearby traffic camera that later helped investigators track his movements. The footage showed him parking his car and walking calmly inside the building. No one reported seeing or hearing anything strange during those early morning hours. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the timeline changed. A security camera mounted above the entrance of Daniel's apartment building recorded him stepping outside into the quiet street. He was wearing jeans, a dark jacket, and the same shoes he had worn earlier that evening. In the footage, he paused briefly near the door as if checking something on his phone, then walked toward his car parked nearby. There was no sign of panic or urgency in his movements. He simply unlocked the vehicle, sat down behind the wheel, and drove away. It would be the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Carter. Morning arrived at the wedding venue several hours later with none of the excitement anyone expected. Emily Rhodes woke early, already thinking about the schedule for the day ahead. Hair appointments, photographs, final decorations, and the ceremony itself were all planned down to the minute. When Daniel failed to send the usual good morning message he often texted her, she assumed he was still sleeping. Around 8 o'clock, she decided to call him just to check in before the preparations began. The phone rang several times before switching to voicemail. At first, Emily didn't think much of it. The previous evening had been long, and Daniel had mentioned he was tired when he left the rehearsal dinner. She assumed he simply hadn't woken up yet. About 30 minutes later, she tried again. Once again, the call went straight to voicemail. That was when she contacted the best man, a close friend of Daniel's named Ryan, asking if he had heard from him. Ryan drove to Daniel's apartment expecting to knock on the door and find him rushing to get ready. But when he arrived, something immediately felt wrong. The parking space where Daniel usually left his car was empty. Ryan walked up to the building and knocked several times, but there was no response from inside. When he called Daniel's phone, the same voicemail message played again. Within the next hour, the excitement surrounding the wedding began to fade into concern. Emily tried calling Daniel repeatedly, each attempt ending the same way. Family members gathered in small groups whispering about what could possibly be delaying him. Some suggested he might have gone out early to pick up something for the ceremony. Others wondered if he had stopped by a friend's house on the way to the venue. But as more time passed without any word from Daniel, those explanations began to feel less convincing. Eventually, someone suggested contacting the police to report him missing. Officers arrived at the apartment building later that morning and began asking questions about the last time anyone had seen him. The search for Daniel Carter officially began that afternoon. Several hours later, investigators received the first major break in the case. A park ranger reported finding a car parked near the entrance of a hiking trail about 30 miles outside town. The vehicle had been sitting there since early morning, according to another visitor who had noticed it but assumed the owner was somewhere on the trail. When officers arrived and ran the license plate, they confirmed the car belonged to Daniel. Inside the vehicle, they discovered several personal items exactly where they might be expected. Daniel's wallet rested inside the glove compartment with his identification and credit cards still inside. The keys were sitting in the center console. Nothing appeared broken or disturbed. There were no signs of a struggle nearby, no footprints leading away that clearly explained where he might have gone. But one important detail immediately stood out. Daniel's phone was missing. Search teams began combing the surrounding forest that same afternoon, hoping to locate him somewhere along the trails. Dogs followed faint scents along the path while volunteers joined the effort, calling Daniel's name into the quiet trees. Helicopters scanned the area from above while officers checked nearby roads and cabins. Hours passed, then another full day. Still, there was no sign of Daniel Carter. And as investigators studied the scene around the abandoned vehicle more carefully, they reached a conclusion that would completely change the direction of the search. Because the evidence suggested something very unusual. Daniel Carter had not gone hiking. The discovery that Daniel Carter had not gone hiking forced investigators to reconsider everything they believed about his disappearance. When search teams finished combing the trails surrounding the abandoned car without finding a single trace of him, detectives began focusing on a different question. If Daniel had not entered the forest that morning, then why had his vehicle been left there in the first place? The location itself seemed unusual. The trailhead was quiet, rarely visited during the early hours of the morning, and located far enough outside town that very few people would pass by before daylight. Whoever left the car there likely knew it would sit unnoticed for hours. Police began developing several possible explanations. One theory suggested Daniel might have run away intentionally. Weddings can bring enormous pressure, and investigators had seen cases where someone chose to disappear rather than face a commitment they felt unprepared for. If Daniel had driven to the trailhead, left his car behind, and accepted a ride from someone else, he could have traveled anywhere without leaving an obvious trail. But the more detectives studied Daniel's life, the less convincing that idea became. His wallet remained in the car along with his identification and credit cards, and his daughter's belongings were still neatly arranged in his apartment. Friends insisted he would never abandon his family without warning. Another theory considered the possibility of suicide. The isolated location of the hiking area might have offered privacy for someone struggling emotionally. Yet search teams had already covered miles of forest and surrounding terrain with trained dogs and aerial support. No clothing, footprints, or personal items had been found beyond the parked car. There was also nothing in Daniel's recent behavior suggesting he was dealing with thoughts that would lead him down that path. His co-workers described him as tired but excited about the wedding, not withdrawn or hopeless. A third possibility was kidnapping. Detectives wondered whether someone might have lured Daniel to the trailhead and forced him into another vehicle. But again, the physical evidence raised doubts. There were no signs of a struggle around the car, and the surrounding dirt showed no clear tire tracks indicating another vehicle had been waiting nearby for long. The situation seemed to resist every explanation investigators attempted to apply. As the search continued, new pieces of evidence began emerging from Daniel's phone records and financial accounts. One of the first discoveries came from a signal report connected to his missing phone. Investigators learned that the device had briefly connected to a cellular tower several hours after the car was found, and that tower was located near Denver International Airport. The signal was weak and short, but it suggested the phone had been active somewhere near the airport late the following evening. That detail immediately raised new questions. If Daniel's phone had traveled that far, someone must have taken it from the car. Around the same time, detectives also discovered a bank withdrawal connected to Daniel's account. $600 had been taken from an ATM less than 24 hours after he disappeared. Surveillance footage from the machine showed a person wearing a baseball cap and dark jacket standing close to the camera in a way that made it impossible to see the face clearly. The figure completed the withdrawal and walked away without leaving any obvious clues behind. Investigators could not determine whether the person was Daniel himself or someone using his card. As these developments surfaced, the story began attracting widespread attention. Local news stations quickly realized the unusual nature of the case. Headlines appeared across television broadcasts and online articles describing the strange disappearance of a groom just hours before his wedding ceremony. One headline read, "Groom vanishes hours before wedding." Another asked a question many viewers were already wondering. Runaway fiancé? Cameras gathered outside the wedding venue where decorations still hung from the day that never happened. Reporters interviewed neighbors and family members, hoping someone might reveal a clue about Daniel's final hours. The town itself soon became divided in its opinions. Some residents believed Daniel had panicked and left town deliberately, unable to face the commitment he had promised. They pointed to the late-night drive away from his apartment as evidence he might have chosen to start over somewhere new. Others rejected that idea entirely. They argued that Daniel's devotion to his daughter and the careful plans he had made for the wedding proved he would never disappear willingly. For them, the situation suggested something much darker had taken place during the night. Amid the growing attention from the public, investigators quietly focused on a small but important detail buried within Daniel's phone records. In the hours before he walked out of his apartment at 2:13 in the morning, his phone had received multiple calls from the same number. The number appeared only once in his entire call history, and it had never contacted him before that night. Detectives traced the calls and discovered they were placed from a prepaid device commonly referred to as a burner phone, a type of phone purchased without personal identification. The records showed that the final call from that number reached Daniel at exactly 1:58 a.m., just 15 minutes before the security camera captured him leaving his apartment. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Immediately afterward, Daniel's phone showed activity suggesting he grabbed his keys and walked outside. Detectives worked to determine who owned the burner phone, but the device itself had already been discarded. It had been used only once, that single call to Daniel, and then it vanished from the network entirely. Whoever placed that call clearly intended to avoid leaving a trail. Still, one piece of information remained attached to the signal. Every phone call connects through a nearby cell tower, and that tower provides a rough location for where the call originated. When investigators traced the tower used during the 1:58 a.m. call, they expected it to lead them somewhere near the hiking trail where Daniel's car had later been found. Instead, the signal came from somewhere completely different. And when police realized exactly where that call had been placed from, the location shocked everyone involved in the case. When investigators traced the signal from the burner phone used to call Daniel Carter at 1:58 a.m., they expected the result to lead them somewhere near the remote trail where his car had later been found. Instead, the data pointed to a location that forced detectives to reconsider one of the central figures in the case. The call had been placed from the parking lot of the hospital where Emily Rhodes worked. The discovery did not immediately prove that Emily had made the call herself, but it raised questions investigators could no longer ignore. Emily had spent the previous evening at the rehearsal dinner surrounded by friends and family, and according to the timeline she provided, she had returned home afterward to prepare for the wedding the next day. Yet the cell tower data suggested that someone using a prepaid phone had been standing in the hospital parking lot just minutes before Daniel left his apartment in the middle of the night. Detectives approached the situation cautiously. At that stage of the investigation, Emily Rhodes was still widely seen as a grieving bride whose wedding day had turned into a nightmare. She had cooperated with police interviews and appeared genuinely distressed about Daniel's disappearance. However, the connection between the phone call and her workplace meant investigators needed to examine her life more carefully. They began reviewing financial records, employment history, and any information that might reveal whether there was more happening behind the scenes of the relationship. What they found surprised even the experienced detectives assigned to the case. Financial documents revealed that Emily had recently taken out a life insurance policy on Daniel Carter. The policy was valued at $80,000 and had been finalized only a few months before the wedding. Life insurance policies between couples are not unusual, especially when families are preparing for marriage and long-term financial planning. But investigators still needed to understand why the policy had been arranged so close to the wedding date, particularly when Daniel already maintained coverage through his job. As they continued reviewing financial records, another detail began to surface. Emily Rhodes was carrying a significant amount of personal debt that few people in her life seemed to know about. Credit card statements showed thousands of dollars in charges spread across multiple accounts, many of them connected to expensive purchases made over the previous year. Some of the accounts were nearing their limits, and several payments had recently been missed. Detectives wondered whether Daniel knew the full extent of these financial problems or whether the situation had been hidden from him. Interviews with friends and neighbors also began revealing details that had not seemed important earlier in the investigation. A couple who lived near Daniel's apartment mentioned hearing raised voices coming from inside the building during one evening about 3 weeks before the wedding. At the time, they assumed the couple was simply arguing about wedding plans. But when investigators returned to speak with them again, the neighbors recalled that the argument sounded unusually tense. They remembered Daniel leaving the building shortly afterward and sitting in his car for a long time before eventually returning inside. The more detectives examined the weeks leading up to the wedding, the more they noticed signs that Daniel and Emily had experienced disagreements that were never shared with friends or family. None of the arguments appeared violent or extreme, but they suggested the relationship may not have been as calm as it appeared on the surface. Still, Disagreements alone could not explain why Daniel had disappeared in the middle of the night or why his car had been abandoned miles away. Then investigators uncovered something that changed the tone of the entire case. While examining Daniel's laptop computer, digital forensics specialists discovered fragments of a deleted message hidden in the system's memory. The message appeared to have been typed but never sent. Although parts of the text were missing, enough remained for investigators to understand its meaning. The message was addressed to Emily Rhodes, and the remaining words were direct and unsettling. "We need to talk before the wedding. I know what you did." The message did not explain what Daniel believed Emily had done, but its existence immediately raised the possibility that he had discovered something serious shortly before his disappearance. When news of the message reached detectives leading the investigation, suspicion around the case intensified. For the first time, investigators began considering the possibility that Daniel's disappearance might be connected to a conflict between the couple that had not yet come to light. Rumors soon spread through the community once word leaked that police were examining Emily more closely. Some residents who had previously defended Daniel began wondering whether he might have uncovered something that placed him in danger. Others still believed there must be another explanation and insisted Emily could not possibly be involved in harming the man she planned to marry. While that debate continued, investigators kept working quietly behind the scenes, focusing on physical evidence from the night Daniel vanished. One of the most important sources of information came from surveillance cameras located near the remote hiking trail where Daniel's car had been discovered. At first, detectives believed those cameras might only confirm the time Daniel's vehicle arrived, but when they reviewed the footage carefully, they noticed something unexpected. The video showed Daniel's car pulling into the small parking area shortly before dawn. The headlights briefly illuminated the empty trail entrance before the vehicle came to a stop. A few minutes passed with no movement, and the car remained parked exactly where the park ranger later found it. Then another set of headlights appeared on the road leading toward the trail. A second vehicle entered the parking area and slowed as it approached Daniel's car. The footage was distant and grainy, making it difficult to identify the model or the driver. The vehicle stopped nearby for a moment before the headlights switched off. The camera angle could not capture what happened next, but it clearly showed that someone else had arrived at the trail shortly after Daniel. For investigators, the discovery confirmed that Daniel had not been alone that night. Yet, as they studied the footage more closely and compared the timing with Emily's known movements, they realized something important. The driver of that second car was not Emily Rhodes. When investigators reviewed the surveillance footage from the trailhead again, they began comparing the second vehicle's arrival time with the movements of everyone connected to Daniel Carter. The car had appeared only minutes after Daniel parked and turned off his engine. Whoever arrived in that vehicle knew exactly where Daniel was going to be. Detectives started examining license plate readers along nearby highways and roads leading toward the trail. Several hours later, one of those systems provided the first real breakthrough in the case. A vehicle traveling toward the trail area during the early morning hours matched a registration belonging to Mark Rhodes. Mark Rhodes was Emily Rhodes's older brother. At first, the connection seemed surprising but not necessarily suspicious. Mark lived only about 40 minutes away and had attended the rehearsal dinner the previous evening. Family members said he left the celebration shortly before midnight. When detectives contacted him for questioning, he initially explained that he had driven around late that night because he couldn't sleep. According to his story, he had gone for a long drive through the countryside and eventually returned home before sunrise. But when investigators placed his vehicle near the trailhead at the exact time Daniel Carter disappeared, the explanation began to fall apart. Detectives brought Mark Rhodes in for a formal interrogation and confronted him with the evidence they had gathered. At first, he denied any involvement in Daniel's disappearance, insisting he had never met Daniel that night. But investigators continued presenting details piece by piece. They showed him the traffic camera images that placed his car on the road leading to the trail. They explained that Daniel had received a mysterious call minutes before leaving his apartment, and that the call came from a location connected to Emily's workplace. They asked him why he had been in that area at the exact moment Daniel's car arrived. Hours passed as the questioning continued. Eventually, Mark's story began to change. According to the statement he later gave to investigators, Daniel Carter had recently discovered something that threatened to destroy both Mark and Emily. Over the previous year, the two siblings had been involved in a scheme that used Daniel's personal information to open several credit accounts without his knowledge. Mark had convinced Emily that the plan would be temporary. They told themselves they would pay the money back before Daniel ever noticed. At first, the idea seemed simple. Mark had access to certain financial systems through his work, and Emily had enough information about Daniel's identity to help open the accounts. Together, they began using those credit lines to cover debts and personal expenses they had accumulated. But as the months passed, the situation grew more complicated. Payments fell behind. Interest increased. What started as a temporary solution quickly turned into thousands of dollars they could no longer repay. Mark later admitted that the pressure had been building for weeks before the wedding. He and Emily had argued privately about how to handle the problem, hoping Daniel would never find out what had happened. Then Daniel discovered the truth. According to Mark's confession, Daniel confronted Emily after noticing unfamiliar financial activity connected to his name. He began asking questions and eventually uncovered enough information to realize someone had opened accounts using his identity. Emily tried to calm the situation, but Daniel insisted he wanted the entire matter explained before the wedding. He told her he planned to report the fraud if he did not receive clear answers. That was when Mark decided to intervene. Using a prepaid phone purchased earlier that week, Mark contacted Daniel late that night and told him they needed to meet privately to talk about the situation before the wedding day. He explained that Emily was afraid Daniel might cancel the ceremony if the truth came out publicly. Mark suggested they meet somewhere quiet where they could resolve the conflict without involving anyone else. Daniel agreed, believing the conversation might finally clarify what had been happening behind his back. The meeting place Mark suggested was the remote hiking trail outside town. When Daniel arrived and parked his car in the empty lot, Mark was already waiting nearby. The two men stepped out of their vehicles and began talking. According to Mark's statement, the conversation quickly became heated. Daniel demanded to know exactly how long the fraud had been happening and how much money was involved. Mark attempted to explain the situation, insisting they had planned to repay everything before Daniel ever noticed. But Daniel refused to accept that explanation. He told Mark the wedding would not happen unless the truth was revealed and the situation was reported to the authorities. The argument continued for several minutes as both men raised their voices in the quiet darkness near the trail entrance. At some point during the confrontation, Daniel turned away and began walking back toward his car. Mark later claimed he panicked, fearing that Daniel would expose everything within hours. He reached out and grabbed Daniel's arm, trying to stop him from leaving. What happened next lasted only seconds. During the struggle, Mark pushed Daniel backward. Daniel lost his footing on the uneven ground beside the trail and fell against a group of rocks near the edge of the path. The impact struck the back of his head with enough force to knock him unconscious immediately. Mark later said he tried shaking Daniel awake, calling his name several times, but Daniel never responded. Realizing the severity of what had happened, Mark began to panic. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision that would shape the rest of the case. Mark dragged Daniel's body away from the parking area and deeper into the wooded area beside the trail, hoping the darkness and thick brush would hide what had occurred. He then returned to Daniel's car, moved several items around to make it appear abandoned, and drove away before sunrise. Later that morning, he contacted Emily and told her everything that had happened during the meeting. According to investigators, Emily made a choice that would place her directly in the middle of the cover-up. Rather than reporting the incident, she helped Mark conceal what had happened. The siblings discussed how to handle Daniel's phone and financial accounts, believing they could create enough confusion to make the disappearance appear voluntary. But the investigation moved faster than they expected, and the evidence eventually pointed directly back to them. Both Mark Rhodes and Emily Rhodes were arrested soon after the confession. The case quickly moved to court, where prosecutors laid out the full timeline of the events leading to Daniel Carter's death. Mark Rhodes faced charges of manslaughter and evidence tampering for the role he played during the confrontation at the trail. Emily Rhodes faced charges connected to the financial fraud scheme, as well as conspiracy related to the attempt to conceal the truth after Daniel was killed. Throughout the trial, witnesses described Daniel as a father who had worked hard to rebuild his life after losing his first wife. Friends testified about his excitement for the wedding and the future he hoped to build with his daughter. Investigators explained the evidence that connected the late-night meeting to the fatal confrontation near the trail. For many people following the case, the details revealed a tragic chain of decisions that began with financial pressure and ended in a moment of panic that could never be undone. But the most emotional moment of the trial came near the end of the proceedings. Daniel Carter's daughter was called to testify. She walked slowly to the witness stand, clutching a small photograph of herself with her father taken several years earlier. The courtroom grew quiet as she looked toward the judge and the jury, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. She explained that Daniel had always been the person who helped her with school projects, who attended every important event in her life, and who made sure she never felt alone after her mother passed away. For several seconds she struggled to continue, wiping tears from her face as the room remained completely silent. Then she said something that no one in the courtroom would forget. "He wasn't just my dad. He was my whole world." When her words ended, the courtroom sat in silence, the weight of the story finally settling over everyone who had followed the case from the beginning.
In the months after the trial ended, the town where Daniel Carter once lived slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The headlines disappeared from television screens, reporters stopped visiting the courthouse, and the crowds that once gathered outside the wedding venue eventually faded away. Yet for the people who had known Daniel personally, the memory of that October morning never truly left. What was supposed to be a day filled with celebration had quietly transformed into something no one expected when they first arrived dressed for a wedding. A wedding that should have been a celebration became a crime scene. The hall where Daniel Carter and Emily Rhodes planned to exchange their vows remained exactly as it had been left that morning for several hours after the news spread that the groom was missing. Rows of white chairs stood neatly arranged along the aisle. Flower arrangements waited near the altar, untouched. On the reception tables nearby, champagne glasses still held the last sips from the rehearsal celebration the night before. Guests who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the beginning of a marriage instead found themselves standing in confused silence, slowly gathering their belongings as the realization settled in that the ceremony would never happen. Some people remembered how quiet the room became when the final decision was made to cancel the wedding. Conversations that had filled the space only hours earlier disappeared completely. Families hugged each other near the entrance before stepping outside, unsure of what they should say or how to explain the situation to others waiting at home for updates. A few guests lingered longer than the rest, staring toward the aisle where Daniel and Emily were meant to walk together. The decorations remained in place long after the crowd had gone, as if the building itself had not yet understood that the celebration it was prepared for had suddenly come to an end. For investigators, the story eventually became another completed case filed among many others that passed through the department. Evidence had been collected, testimony had been heard, and the legal system delivered its verdict. Yet even with the facts established in court, the emotional weight of the case continued to follow those who had watched it unfold from the beginning. The disappearance, the search through the woods, and the discovery of what really happened on that dark trail left a lasting mark on a community that had once believed it was simply preparing for a joyful wedding weekend. Friends of Daniel Carter often returned to the same thought whenever they reflected on the story. In their memories, the entire chain of events could be traced back to one small moment that seemed almost ordinary when it first occurred. It happened quietly in the early hours of the morning, long before the sun rose over the town and long before guests began arriving at the wedding hall expecting to celebrate. Because in the end, everything began with a single phone call. A call placed in the darkness of the night, reaching Daniel Carter just 15 minutes before he stepped outside his apartment and drove away from the life he had been preparing to begin. And that call came at exactly 1:58 in the morning. Even after the verdicts were delivered and the courtroom doors finally closed on the case of Daniel Carter, one question continued to echo through conversations among those who followed the story from the very beginning. The evidence revealed what happened near the hiking trail that night, and Mark Rhodes's confession explained how the confrontation ended in tragedy. Yet many people still found themselves returning to the moments that came before Daniel walked out of his apartment at 2:13 in the morning. Those final minutes before he stepped into his car remain the part of the story that continues to divide opinions. Because here is the question that still lingers for many people who studied every detail of the case. Did Emily Rhodes plan everything that happened that night, knowing Daniel had discovered the financial fraud and arranging for Mark to meet him before the truth could come out? Or did events simply spin out of control once Daniel confronted them about what he had uncovered, turning a desperate conversation into a fatal moment that neither of them intended? The investigation revealed the scheme involving Daniel's identity, and it proved that both Emily and Mark had been hiding a serious secret from the man who trusted them. But the exact intentions behind that late-night meeting are something only the people involved truly understood. Some believe Emily knew exactly what Mark was going to do when he called Daniel using the burner phone. Others think she expected nothing more than a tense conversation meant to convince Daniel to keep the secret until the wedding passed. The truth, as with many real stories like this, sits somewhere inside those unanswered moments between the phone call at 1:58 a.m. and the moment Daniel Carter left his home for the final time. So now we want to hear from you. What do you think really happened before Daniel left the house that night? Do you believe Emily Rhodes carefully planned the meeting that led Daniel to the trail? Or do you think the situation simply collapsed into tragedy once Daniel demanded the truth about the fraud? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know what your theory is after hearing the full story. And if this story shocked you, wait until you hear about another case we're covering soon. The story of a bride who disappeared during what was supposed to be the happiest honeymoon of her life. If you enjoy real crime stories that reveal the hidden twists behind events that first appear ordinary, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next investigation.